Dear friends and colleagues, I'd like to welcome you at this first online ENERPO Workshop Series lecture that we're doing today on May 5. We will certainly make a recording available later. Our guest speaker, Dr. Mikhail Krutikhin, has kindly agreed for us to publish this video later. So for those who couldn't watch it right now or can join us later, there'll be an opportunity to watch the lecture a little bit later. Just one or two lines about the program. ENERPO is an MA program, an English language MA program on energy politics in Eurasia that is taught here at the European University at St. Petersburg. Available for all Russian and non-Russian citizens, and we're very much hopeful to start our new semester in fall, September 2020, as planned, either offline or online. We will see how the life will show how it goes. But I won't take too much of your time, and I'd like to very briefly introduce and welcome again Dr. Mikhail Krutikhin. Say that we're very much thankful and grateful for him to agree to spare us some time and tell us about Russian oil and gas given the current circumstances. And unless Professor Nikita Lomagin, the academic director of the ENERPO program, has or wants to add anything at this moment, I would just, rather go ahead and right now and give the floor to Dr. Krutikhin. And just last housekeeping things, Mikhail will be speaking for about 45 minutes to an hour. We'll see how it goes. And then we will have a Q&A session. So please, if you do have any questions or something, keep them, remember them, take notes, or you can also use the chat here to write those questions if you don't want to forget them. And also, I kindly ask you to keep your microphones muted as you're doing it right now. Thanks for doing so. So that's it. Let's go ahead.
So do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So first, I would like to speak about how it all happened, how we found ourselves in this situation when Russia has to cut down oil production. It has not done so for the whole history of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and the current Russia. And now the country has to change its paradigm of behavior and to start cutting down production instead of increasing that. Well, the situation started not with the coronavirus outbreak, but a couple of months before that. There were predictions of an imminent drop in demand for fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. And first, the predictions were about the year 2040. It was in the outlook of BP, and then it was in the outlook prepared by the Energy Center in the Moscow Business School. And then after a year, the predictions started to say that it would be 2035. When oil was going to go down because there would be the beginning of the end of the oil era, because demand was going to decrease. And then it was 2030, then 2025, and suddenly, all of a sudden, we saw that there was something which Nassim Taleb called the Black Swan. It was the outbreak of the coronavirus in China, and one of the few largest consumers of energy, China, was out of the way, and demand for fossil fuels and for energy as a whole decreased suddenly on a very dramatic scale, absolutely. Well, everybody expected, well, first, that it would be the end of the large economic cycle. And in September, October, and November, everybody believed, well, we are in the beginning of the decline, economic decline globally, because some of the countries were showing signs of entering a recession phase. And some of them even were believed to be heading for stagnation, but not only recession. And after the outbreak of that virus, we understood that maybe, as I heard yesterday, maybe the peak of oil demand and oil consumption happened in 2019, but not in 2025 or any other year. Maybe we are not going to see the return of a dramatic increase of demand for primary energy and fossil energy ever and ever. Today I saw another prediction. It came from Norway's company, Restart Energy. They said that, well, because this year we are witnessing a drop in investments in the petroleum industry. This is why by 2025, we're going to see a deficit of oil, maybe 5 million barrels per day. And it means that maybe the price of oil would go to $65 per barrel of Brent. Well, that's a prediction. But after the outbreak of the coronavirus, we saw another black swan, and it was a quarrel between Russia and Saudi Arabia in the early March, when in Vienna, OPEC and partners of OPEC were discussing possibilities of expanding the agreement of OPEC Plus. And the Saudis insisted on another cut in production, but the Russians wanted continuation of the same order, of the same, well, circumstances. In fact, for 3 years, Russia had not been cutting down its production at all, but only declaring that it was, well, in solidarity with OPEC Plus, Russia is cutting down production. But every year, if you looked at the records, you saw that Russia was increasing production instead of decreasing that. Well, on the 6th of March, the Saudis said, okay, let's do something, at least, please cut down a little bit. So we are in the middle of a very grave situation because there is a sharp drop of demand, it's coronavirus and everything. So we need some sort of a solidarity. But Russia preferred to close down the agreement of OPEC Plus, and the Russian leadership did it so clumsily that the Saudis got upset. And they started a price war. They said, okay, we are increasing production and we are offering tremendous discounts on the price of our Saudi barrels of oil on the same markets where Russia is selling its own oil. So when the war started, the United States administration had to come to the rescue of the global energy system, and there were negotiations between President Trump, the Russian President Putin, and the King of Saudi Arabia. It was the king, the old and ailing king, but not the crown prince, because the crown prince was very hurt by the behavior of the Russian team at the OPEC negotiations, and didn't want to speak to the Russians at all at that moment. Well, it took several days of very, very hard negotiations, but then after, well, some period, driven by the pricing war, Moscow agreed to come along and to agree to a decrease of Russian production. And it was not just an agreement between OPEC members and a few countries which joined this temporary alliance, including Russia. It was an agreement which was blessed by G20, because at the session of G20, the members of this group agreed to form a supervisory body to watch how the members of this new agreement comply with the requirements and decrease production. So it's basically an international agreement, not just an agreement with some group of countries. So Russia has to do exactly that. And it is difficult for Russia. First, it is psychologically absolutely difficult to start decreasing production, because the Russian companies has not done anything like that before. The idea was to increase exploration and extraction of mineral reserves as much as possible, to reach new records, to conquer new markets. And now they have to wrap up their equipment and technologies and to start trimming down the volume of production of oil. It is not just the agreement with OPEC Plus, which is forcing the Russian companies to do that. It started in March when some Russian companies understood they cannot sell their oil. Tatneft, one of the companies, decreased production by 2.5%. And the companies that produce oil off Sakhalin Island, Sakhalin 1 and Sakhalin 2 international consortia, they had to decrease production by 2.6% either, because there were no willing customers and the demand was not enough to justify production at all. Nevertheless, Russia increased production in March, generally, the whole industry, in April, but now it has to do something about that. And it's an absolutely great problem for Russia. It's not just psychology, it's not just the change of the paradigm of the industry. It is technically very difficult. It would be useful to compare the Russian oil industry with the Saudi oil industry. In Saudi Arabia, a regular well produces about 1,000 or 2,000 tons of oil daily. And the company Saudi Aramco is very flexible in its oil production. According to the wishes of the Saudi political leadership, the company can plug down some of the wells and then open up the taps again when it is necessary. And it is absolutely so it's flexible. In Russia, the average well produces just 9.5 tons, not 1,000 tons, not 100 tons, but 9.5 tons daily. And if the Saudis want to close down just one well, the Russians will have to close down maybe 200 wells like that to achieve the same result in the decrease in oil production. Moreover, in Saudi Arabia, oil comes under the from the reservoirs, from the place, because there is some pressure in the place. It can be a fountain. In Russia, only 1.7% of wells operate with the free flow of oil from subsoil. 85% of Russian wells have to operate with pumps. It is either submersible electric pumps in the well or the pumps which we see in the movies, such as the pumps on the surface. And there is another problem. When we see the Russian projects and the Russian fields, we see that it is not just oil that comes from underground, it is mostly water. Because to make some pressure on the reservoir, the Russians have to inject water in separate wells to replace oil and to push it upwards. And in some of the oil fields, such as the legendary Samotloor oil fields, the largest in the Russian oil history, it is not oil that comes from the wells, it is mostly water, and only 4% of that fluid is actually oil. So this is another question. How many wells like that Russia has to shut down if it wants to achieve the same result as Saudi Arabia in just plugging down a couple of Saudi wells? So that's a problem. Then some Russian wells and oil fields are located in the Arctic. And if you close down the well might get frozen. And to open it up again, it would take a lot of effort solvents and heating apparatus, and it will be a work over, a repair of the well. It is costly. It requires a lot of people to get engaged in those operations. And then in some Russian fields, we have not just oil, but the oil is bituminous, viscous, contaminated with paraffins. And if you close down the flow, paraffins would clog down the well and destroy it. So now Russian companies will have to decide what to do. Maybe to close down, tens of thousands of wells which produce not a very commercial amounts of oil, old wells, or maybe to close down the best wells they have and to keep that oil underground until better times. So this is a very difficult choice for the Russians. And I believe now the companies are going to close down the whole producing sites, not just the wells. It is difficult. It takes a lot of labor, cost, and I have not yet heard from the management of Russian oil companies how exactly they are going to do that. There is no plan. And Rosneft, the largest oil company in Russia, had a gathering of its board on the 30th of April, just before the agreement with OPEC Plus was going to begin, because the decrease of the production is scheduled for 2 months, May and April. And the Russians have not done anything else to prove that they are actually doing that. And it seems to be a very big problem, because if this supervisory body of G20 decides that one of the partners in that agreement, namely Russia, does not comply with the agreement, maybe there would be some international punishment for Russia, some sanctions, for example, against Rosneft as a state company, against some other sellers of Russian oil, buyers of Russian oil, or maybe against some American companies that are engaged in providing field services to Russian companies, such as Schlumberger, Halliburton, Baker Hughes, and some other companies. It will also be a very big problem for the Russians, such sanctions. It would mean a collapse of the Russian oil industry, which is the backbone of the Russian economy still. Well, it is still a very big question if Russia can reduce its oil production, if the Russian companies are going to sabotage the decision of the OPEC Plus, and then will Russia be punished for lack of compliance with the agreement? It is absolutely impossible now to say what the outcome is going to be. But anyhow, if Russia actually continues along the way of reducing production, it is going to find itself in an absolutely new situation globally. We see that in the energy sector, the global energy sector, there is a big uncertainty about the duration of the pandemic. We do not know when it is going to be finished, conquered, or whether it is going to continue, whether there are new outbreaks of virus cases. And so people are, observers of the industry believe that maybe we'd better calculate the period of 2 years. Before the 2 years are over, the global demand for oil is not going to recover to the pre-virus level. A very good example is China. China says, okay, our epidemics is, well, over, we are recovering, and our industry has almost recovered. We see that China is buying more oil than it was buying before the outbreak of the virus. But this oil, very cheap oil, goes into strategic storage facilities of China, but not into the industry, most of that. And the industry has not recovered to 100%. Maybe it has recovered 70% or 75%. And it could be a good example of what can be expected globally when other countries start to recover from the outbreak of the virus. I do not think that the recovery of demand is going to be as quick as we hope it might be. Then we are witnessing a decarbonization efforts of the European countries and some other countries. In the EU, there was recently a gathering of very impressive teams from several nations, which are proposing a program of encouraging a transfer to a greener energy instead of the energy based on fossil fuels. And if some people will believe that maybe cheap oil would encourage the continuation of using regular cars, gasoline-driven, diesel-driven cars, I think they might be mistaken. And the European governments and some other governments probably are going to continue their program of subsidizing green energy and switching to something like wind, solar energy, hydrogen, and biofuels, and so on and so forth, instead of oil, gas, and coal. So this is also an uncertainty, but I think, well, the tendency points in that direction. Then another new factor on the market is the price war. And we see that while Saudi Arabia and other countries of OPEC have promised to cut down production, nobody has promised, well, stability of the prices they charge for their oil. And Saudi Arabia is offering tremendous discounts on its oil. Just yesterday, Iraqi oil sellers complained that the Saudis are pushing them out of some markets, such as India, and replacing them in their traditional market niches. We see that the Saudis are selling oil of about the same quality as Russian oil in northwestern Europe, in northern Europe, in Poland, for example, on some other markets. And they are competitors for Russian suppliers of Russian crude oil. And this war is going to go on. And it will be very difficult for Russian producers of oil to compete. I have to mention a study which was made last year, 2019, by IHS Markit, when they were comparing the cost of producing Russian oil, Saudi oil, American oil, and some other types of geographical types of oil, when they were preparing the IPO of Saudi Aramco. They came to the conclusion that for a new oil project in Saudi Arabia, the break-even price of a barrel on the global scale should be just $17. This is not very much. It includes some 10% of profit margin, and it covers all the costs. For Russia, a project launched in the same circumstances should require a break-even price of $42 per barrel. So for Russia, it is very difficult to compete with the Saudis. No, the Russians are not going to leave the market to the Saudis and abandon the scene. Absolutely. No, there would be some buyers of Russian oil. There would be some market for Russian oil because the Saudis cannot replace all of it, physically cannot replace that. But the market niches of Russian oil are going to shrink. I'm sure of that because of that competition and the price war. And when the dust settles down after the pandemic, I think it would be an absolutely new picture, absolutely new environment for business for the Russian petroleum industry. And there are some questions. First, the industry might recover as well technologically minded if the Russians close down the least efficient old wells and they are left with some modern, more economic wells that require modern technologies, advanced equipment and so on. It would be another type of an industry as a whole if this scenario materializes. But the problem remains what is going to happen to the Russian budget. Because now it is half of the revenues to the Russian budget comes from oil and gas. If oil is very cheap, or if the amount of oil Russia can market goes down, so the Russian budget is going to suffer. Right now, this year, the break-even price of barrel for the Russian budget is $42.40 per barrel of Brent. And if the price is over this level, then the difference goes into the sovereign fund of Russia, the welfare fund. If the price is below that that level, then the sovereign fund has to provide some financing to the federal budget. Now, well, maybe 3 months ago, the finance minister of Russia said, okay, we've got enough money in the sovereign fund to last for 6 years. Then a little bit later, they said, okay, 3 years. Now, last week, the Minister of Finance said that this year, they are going to spend 45% of the sovereign fund. So if it is 45% this year and the 50% next year, then there will be no sovereign fund in Russia anymore. And it will be a problem of financing the Russian budget. It will be a very grave predicament for the Russian budget. Yes, Russia also has some reserves of gold and foreign currency, but it will be difficult to start spending that reserve as well. So it is still the problem that has not been addressed adequately. Well, I have been speaking about oil for quite a while. Maybe there would be some questions about that. I'm going to address the problems in the natural gas industry of Russia. So it's a very specific sector of the Russian economy. It is very much politicized. We do not have free market of gas inside Russia. We have a monopoly for gas transportation and gas export, which is Gazprom. And Gazprom does not behave as a, well, commercial company because very often it makes a politicized decision and a very costly decision at that. We basically, the scheme is like that. The Russian leaders, political leadership, comes up with a geopolitical idea, such as, let us punish Ukraine because it does not follow the political well, lead of the Kremlin. Let us do something like leaving the Ukrainians without revenues from gas transportation. Okay, and then some, well, individuals come up with proposals. Let us build Nord Stream and South Stream gas pipelines, which will bypass Ukraine, and it will do the trick. You will have what you want. Okay, and then billions and billions of dollars are spent on those projects. The political goal proves out to be unreachable because in the final run, Gazprom has to sign a transit agreement with Ukraine. And the new pipelines are mostly political, non-economical at all, because, everybody counts, okay, for the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, it is about 10 billion euro. For the South Stream, it is 17 billion euro. Nobody includes the cost of the new gas transportation corridor, which has been built from the Arctic Yamal Peninsula to the Black Sea and to the Baltic Sea terminals of the streams. And the cost of that new transportation corridor is tremendous. We have the calculations made by one of the R&D institutes of Gazprom, VNI-Gas, which says that the price tag for that corridor is over $92 billion. And it does not reach the coast of the sea. It stops half of the way. So to spend more than $100 billion on the pipelines inside Russia to take gas to the entrance to of Nord Stream and South Stream projects, nobody speaks about that, but this is costly, and this is a very heavy burden on Gazprom and on the Russian budget as well, because half of Gazprom belongs to the Russian taxpayers. It's a state company after all. And now we see that Gazprom, as a monopoly, is facing very, very grave challenges. It has come under pressure. The first type of pressure is from insufficient demand for Russian gas, mostly in Europe, in China as well. China does not need all the gas that Russia can offer to China. Second, low prices. We see that the price of gas inside Europe is about the same as the price of gas for Russian industrial consumers inside Russia. So Gazprom does not get anything in profit, and in some cases Gazprom is in the red. So the cash flows of that company sometimes they fall to the negative zone. So it's a financial pressure for Gazprom. Then we see that there is another type of pressure from the Europeans. They have their anti-monopoly regulations, which say that if you want to continue delivering gas through Nord Stream 2, for example, or the future Turk Stream, if it enters the European Union at all, then Gazprom will have to allow third-party access to the same pipeline, which means that gas produced by non-Gazprom companies in Russia would enter the same pipeline and reach European customers. Then the Europeans demand the operatorship and ownership of gas pipelines of Gazprom, not to be, a monopoly of Gazprom. They should be an independent gas transmission operator, and Gazprom just cannot do that. First, according to Russian laws, Gazprom is the monopoly for exports and the monopoly for transportation of gas. So Russia will have to change the legislation to allow Gazprom to comply with the anti-monopoly rules of the main consumers of the Russian gas, which is the European Union. It is a very serious predicament for the Russia. And there were several attempts of reforming Gazprom because of such pressures. In the last such attempt occurred in 2012, and there was a lot of noise in the Russian media, international media. Okay, there will be a real market of gas inside Russia, and Gazprom will have to be reformed. Gazprom will have to be split into a transportation company, which will be government controlled, just like Transneft for oil is controlled in Russia, and it will provide transmission services to all the owners of gas in Russia, and it will be market. Then it will be to create equal conditions for all sellers of natural gas in Russia. Gazprom will have to abandon its monopoly status for exports. Then equal is equal. So other companies would be able to export their gas too. Okay, in the year 2012, there was such a proposal, but the resistance from Gazprom was very strong, and the resistance from the finance ministry was strong. The finance ministry argued that if you have a great reform like that, say goodbye to a great portion of revenues to the federal budget, because any reform means loss of revenues. Well, that's the law. Second, Gazprom said, okay, I'm responsible for gas delivery to Russian regions, to the provinces, and if I'm not able to continue like that, there could be social problems, social strife, and unpleasant population will come to the streets and so on. And so this is why the Russian president said at that time, if you prove to me that the positive effect of the reform is larger than the expected negative effect, then we'll discuss this issue at the Presidential Energy Commission. If you are not unable to prove that, then forget about it. So far, we are still expecting. Maybe there will be such a reform, because there is another type of pressure, which is some additional pressure on Gazprom. We have the owners of the companies that have made great money by building unnecessary non-economical gas pipelines for Gazprom. They are very close friends of the Russian president, and they see that there will be no great projects anymore. They have done what they wanted. And if they would be interested, this is just a scenario, if they would be interested in acquiring control over the future parts of Gazprom, which are going to be available after the company is broken into several parts, then maybe they would be interested to become, well, producers of LNG in Arctic. We have some successful stories about producing LNG in Arctic by an international consortium of Russia's Novatek, French Total, and 2 Chinese companies. They are quite successful because they produce gas without paying any taxes to the Russian Federation. Well, the friends of the president would be interested in switching from the business of building unnecessary pipelines to the business of making LNG, which has some future on the global market. And this is a very strong argument in favor of dismantling Gazprom and restructuring the Russian gas industry. We still do not know if this is possible or not, because the final decision would belong to the well, inhabitant of the Kremlin. Today, when we see that the leadership of the country is preoccupied with coronavirus and other low oil prices and other problems, I do not think that it is possible to expect any reforms of Gazprom. But maybe after a while, under all those types of pressure, Gazprom will have to be restructured. Well, then we can switch to a very interesting question, which some people ask me after the pandemic. What do you really expect that there will be a transfer to a greener energy? Maybe it will signal an end of the efforts to switch to electric carriages and fuel cells, hydrogen fuel cells. Maybe cheap oil would be a temptation to stay in friendship with gasoline and diesel-driven cars. Well, I thought about that. I think that the efforts of the governments, not only in Europe, but also in Asia, in the United States, might point to the direction of energy transfer, to a healthier world, to a greener type of energy, and maybe they will, many of the countries and many budgets of some well-developed countries would be focusing on financing the efforts for that energy transfer, but not on encouraging oil-driven vehicles. This is not 100% certainty, but I believe this is a very good scenario and it is worth watching. I think I will be prepared to take some questions from the audience.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. We could all hear well. Yes, we're all clapping our hands. Thanks for keeping all your microphones muted so far. We will just go very simple. I think I'll give the floor to Professor Lomagin for just a couple of minutes if he has any comments or feedback. And then we'll proceed. I've already received, I think, 4 or 5 questions from participants. If you have any others in your minds, there's a way here to raise your hand in the chat box or in the video, or use the chat box, as I said. So anyway, I hope to give a chance for everyone to give their comments or questions. But first, let's go with Nikita Lomagin.
Yeah, actually, just let me say a few words after very interesting, very provocative, as usual, presentation by Mikhail. And many topics have been raised, and including price war and the reasons for this price war, and when it began, and what might be consequences for different countries who might be able to win this war. And if I understood you correctly, Russia has a few chances to win, though there are people who believe that Saudis are not a very good fix to wage lasting price war for domestic issues, for political instability, etc. And there is a unusual ally for Russia in this ongoing price war, potential price war, which is the United States, which is, so to say, an elephant in the room. And when we are discussing the current oil shock, we have to keep in mind the situation in the United States, coming elections, and the situation for Mr. Trump and his willingness to please his constituency in the oil sector. And this is not only my comment and my question to you: what position will take the United States or Trump administration in this particular crisis? And of course, one of the most interesting issues you raised was the question about reforming. What are preconditions, what are prerequisites for Gazprom, for oil sector in Russia to get started long expected reforms to break up monopoly, etc. And of course, the question is whether we reached already the situation when those reforms are actually to be started or launched by Russian administration. And maybe just a couple of related questions. What's your take on the most recent comments by Deputy Minister of Energy, Mr. Sorokin, who explained basically the reasons for Russia not to sign the agreement with Saudi Arabia on March 6th, and he gave 5 or 6 points, and he said that OPEC's, average OPEC and CAPEX for majority of Russian oil fields was very close to Saudis. It's not $42 per barrel, as you said, but in the range between 10 to 20 dollars per barrel, which means that Russian oil maybe is less competitive than Saudi oil, but still is rather competitive in comparison with American oil, right? So maybe we should look at this triangle and not to reduce this oil war exclusively to contest between Riyadh and Moscow. But in general, thank you very much for very interesting, very informative, and very provocative presentation, which basically provides us with many angles to discuss the Russian energy sector. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I think there were quite a few questions. Well, first, I do not agree with Mr. Sorokin, because first, I have some information about the arguments which were presented in March 1 at the meeting of President Putin with the bosses of Russian oil companies, when the decision was made to abandon OPEC Plus abruptly, but not quietly, not politely, and so on. The arguments were just like that. First, if we do it immediately, when the price goes down and when there isn't the outbreak of the virus, it will be the most sensitive blow to two main competitors. First, it will be Saudi Arabia. If we do it right now, in 2.5 years, the Saudis will have no money left in their sovereign funds, and they will go bankrupt. Second, the United States shale producers of shale oil. If we do it right now, when the price is low, and if we contribute to the downslide of the price, then a lot of American shale companies will go bankrupt before the end of the year. Another argument was about the Russian oil industry. First, the Russian companies have accumulated a lot of financial reserves, and they have enough oil reserves to produce additional volumes of oil with the production cost below $20 per barrel. That was an argument. And there is enough money in the Russian sovereign fund also to last for at least 5 or 6 years. So let's do it right now. It would be a sensitive blow. And so we are going to prove to the world that Russia is a great energy power and it can dictate its conditions and terms to the other world, to the rest of the world. And that was the most important argument of all, because we understand that for the Russian leadership, appearances very often are much more important than actual commercial gains or losses or anything like that. It was a clear underestimation of the potential of the competitors and overestimation of the Russian potential to survive in the circumstances. So that led to the wrong decision to do it abruptly. That was it. Now we hear a lot about the ability of the Russian companies to operate at low prices. The boss of Tatneft says, okay, $9 per barrel, we can still go on. Okay, yes, maybe Tatneft can go on because most of its wells are very, very old. And they do not need any new encouragement or new technologies to continue operation. It's not a major producer, but very old-fashioned producer. Yes, maybe lifting costs of that oil are not very high. But for Russian companies, which are hoping to tap new reserves, and the new reserves are mostly in the middle of nowhere without any new transportation infrastructure and, equipment delivery infrastructure, and 70% of remaining oil reserves in Russia are officially considered to be in the hard to recover category, which requires a very large break-even price of oil to be commercial. Some of them require, as Lukoil used to say, $80 per barrel. That would be the price that Russian tight oil requires to get extracted from underground. Okay, so it will be a great problem for Russia to increase production and to stop production from falling, because, well, 2 years ago, the Minister of Energy, when he was speaking to the Russian parliament, he said that by the year 2035, Russia is going to lose 40% of its oil production because of the deterioration of the quality of reserves. So Russia is not competitive with Saudi Arabia or even with the shale producers in the United States. Well, shale production is a problem itself. But it would be, I think, not very wise to hope that the shale companies in the United States are going to get bankrupt. Because first, it seems to be a semantical mistake. In the Kremlin, people believe that bankruptcy is, well, the bankruptcy of the 19th century type. They are not aware of Article 11 for bankruptcy laws in the United States, where bankruptcy is restructuring of the debt, changing the owner, or some other measures. It's not liquidation of a business. It is continuing the business. And shale industry is very, very flexible. If the price goes up to $40 to $45 per barrel, maybe in a couple of weeks, in 1 month, maybe half of the now abandoned wells in the shale industry of the United States are going to be rejuvenated and expecting the fleets of hydrofracking teams ready to, well, to increase production, not only to return to the previous level, but to increase production. They are very flexible, just like the Saudis. So the problem with the United States is maybe the election year, maybe the great differences between the attitudes of the Congress and the White House vis-a-vis Russia. I don't think that the US administration is prepared to go ahead with some very dramatic sanctions about Russia if Russia does not comply with the requirements of OPEC+. But the Congress is something other. Nobody expected the Congress to pass that law on sanctions against Nord Stream 2, because the administration was not very eager to go ahead with such sanctions. But some people on the Congress, they managed to include that piece of legislation into the defense budget of the United States, which had to be passed by the White House, and so it passed. And so I believe that the Congress can do quite a lot to win over the White House and to punish Russia for something which it might do in the future. As to the Saudis, yes, it would be futile to expect the Saudis to go bankrupt and to spend it. First, in Russia, in the Kremlin, they believe that the break-even price of oil for the Saudis is $80 or $85 per barrel. Without that, they cannot, their budget would not be a profit budget or a deficit budget. It would, if we take a look at the prospects of the budget, of the Saudi budget for the next year, the break-even price of oil is $63, not $85. Then we see that they are prepared to abandon some of the projects, very costly projects of building new modern cities or something. They just delay those projects, and they have quite a lot of money as revenues from their investments in the United States, for example, or all over the world. So they are, as the Saudis say, just yesterday, the finance minister of Saudi Arabia said, it will be painful, but we will manage. And I looked at his arguments. I believe he was right. Yes, they can manage. I cannot say the same about the Russian budget and the Russian ability to resist the circumstances now. But any other questions?
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, sir. We do have several questions, and I hope you'll have time to answer all of them. But if you're very short of time, please let us know. I'll try to sort them out somehow. Several questions are related to oil and oil prices, and others are about natural gas. So I will go in varying order. But before that, since you already touched upon US companies, here's one question somewhat related to probably what Nikita Andreevich just asked. It's a question from Irina Mironova, a lecturer at our ENERPO program. She's asking, what are the obligations of the US oil companies under this new agreement, and how these obligations will be verified and enforced?
Well, there could be no obligations at all, because there is something in the US legislation which is called the Sherman Act of 1890, which prohibits cartels, trusts, and monopoly practices at all. They cannot participate in efforts to manipulate volumes of production in order to, to stabilize prices, to change the prices. They are prohibited to do that. Yes, voluntarily, some regulators, for example, in Texas, the Railway Commission in Texas, which has the instruments to introduce some quotas for production in that state, can do something to regulate production there. They are reluctant to do that. Or legislators in North Dakota. But now we see that some American companies quite voluntarily close down some of the projects, some of the wells. They suspend operations in some production sites because there is not enough demand, not because OPEC Plus or anyone else asked them to do that. It's the same with Norway, for example. Norway also said, okay, yes, we are decreasing production, because we see that that is necessary. Yes, they can do that because there is a regulator, it has some instruments for that, but it is voluntarily, not by any kind of agreement. So if the situation changes, if the demand recovers, and we now are witnessing some signals of recovering demand for motor fuel in the United States. We see that the stockpiling is not increasing the last week. Everybody expected the American storage of oil to be almost full and impossible to accept new oil. We see now there is a reduction of that volume. We see a reduction of the volume which is stored in the tankers in the sea. So the situation is not as bad as it seems for the American oil industry. I think the main regulator is the invisible hand of the market.
All right, thank you. So a group of questions still on the oil, and as I said, then we will pass on to gas. Please give me 1 minute to try to compile them all together. It's a group of questions actually coming from Mr. Maxim Nedria, a CEO and co-founder of an energy consulting agency in Bratislava, Slovak Republic. So the first, they're quite point by point questions. One is how to explain the actual rise of Brent crude oil future contracts price from USD $16 on April 22 to up to $30 as of today, May 05. Then the question continues, what are the perspectives of Russian oil industry if the low price period of $15 to $30 lasts for 2020 and 21, or maybe even up to 2025? Can the industry be nationalized completely? I assume oil industry in Russia. Then a related question to oil, again coming from Mr. Pavel Kaplun in Israel. Today, the prices of oil are skyrocketing since the bottom rates. What can be the reasons for this? Can it be a new trend, so the prices are going to recover because of the OPEC Plus agreement and US shale oil producers bankruptcy? Well, I guess you have already partially answered this, but I feel obliged to read them out.
First, about nationalization over the Russian oil industry. Yes, there was some talk about that, especially when we have such a company as Rosneft, which is officially government controlled. And the tendency is towards nationalization. In the year 1995, only 7.5% of Russian oil was produced by the state, companies associated with the Russian government. Now it is 63%, because Rosneft has taken over a lot of very efficient commercial companies, starting with Yukos, then TNK-BP, Bashneft, Udmurtneft, and so on and so forth. And the company has got very large and less efficient than the former parts of that. I do not think it is possible in this situation. Because, for example, Lukoil is a private company with the ownership split among a lot of people, not only in Russia, but also abroad. A lot of business outside Russia. It is not possible just to take over some packages of shares and then to establish control over some, controlling interest or veto interest. I don't think it is possible right now. And so Russia also needs some private business to show off. There is Surgutneftegas. It's an absolutely mystery. The company has accumulated almost $50 billion on bank accounts. It is not expanding. It is, xenophobic. It does not want any foreign partners or any joint ventures. We have some small companies such as Tatneft, and I do not think it is possible to nationalize any of those companies because of several circumstances. That's one. Then it's a very, very sensitive issue, the movement of the prices of the barrel. When the price goes up, then the observers usually say, well, it happened along the background of, and then there is some sort of an argument which happened to the industry or around the industry, some declaration or so on. In fact, right now, we see that the price of oil, such as the closest approximation to the actual market price, is dated Brent, for example. And dated Brent is determined daily by two agencies, Argus and
S&P Platts?
Yes, and Platts, sorry. And it is based on the actual transactions on the market, plus in the formula, there are some expectations on the market which are reflected in the future contracts, the future contract for the next month and for a couple of months ahead. Is it contango or is it backwardation? Or so are they higher or are they lower? So everything affects the dated price, and then there is differentials and spreads from the dated price to the price of Russian Urals, for example, or Azeri Light, or some other types of oil. But the problem is that the future contracts are they are financial instruments of the financial markets. They do not represent the actual transactions in oil, and they are, well, for the past maybe over 35 years, they are the victim of speculations. When there was some era before the year, before OPEC came to the arena, there was just, the price was determined by contracts between the seller and the buyer. That was very simple. Then when OPEC was organized, it was some sort of a manipulation of the volumes for the sake of prices and embargoes and whatever, a lot of instruments. Then in the early 80s, there was the electronic trade in the futures, and very gradually some very large scale players on that market learned how to manipulate those prices. And for them, if for OPEC, stability was the target, for those guys, it is volatility is the target, because they collect profit at the upper end of the price and the lower end of the price. They want the price to move frantically between the extremes. And when we are looking at the prices of the future contract, we might witness the same situation which occurred quite a while ago, when the price of WTI barrel fell. It was minus 37 and 63 cents. It was incredible, but it was the result of speculations on that financial market, not because the price of oil was something like that on the physical market of oil. So it will be very difficult to predict. First, there are something which is called algorithms. The computer software which reacts to declarations, to events globally, and in milliseconds, it gives orders to sell or to buy contracts. We cannot predict that. If a Russian energy minister comes to the microphone and said, okay, we are in solidarity with OPEC Plus, we are decreasing production. In a moment, the price goes to the required direction, even though actually Russia does absolutely nothing to carry out the promises of the Russian minister. So we cannot predict the movement of the prices. Now we see that maybe it would be very interesting to watch the expiry date of the WTI and the June contract, the July already contract of Brent, but nobody can predict that. It is a gamble of big boys, I would say, the financial speculators, but not the actual market. Maybe in the price of oil, some 30% now is determined by the balance of supply and demand. The 70% is determined by speculations on the financial market. So I cannot comment on the price going right now to $30 per barrel of Brent for the future contract or to some other movements.
Thank you. Now we're passing from oil to natural gas. And here comes one question from Mr. Nodar Hornaouli, currently in Georgia, one of our ENERPO students, actually. The question is, are there any potential negative effects of Gazprom's unbundling or deregulating of Russian gas industry in general, or is it only beneficial?
I believe it would be beneficial, both to Gazprom, to the Russian budget, to consumers. The consumers would be able to choose which producer of gas, which supplier of gas offers the best price. And reliability and other factors are on the agenda, so to say. In Russia, if we have a market for gas, actually, it would push up the ability of the Russian economy to go forward. Because right now, when we have the monopoly, it is difficult for other owners of gas, producers of gas, to operate like that. So I am against monopolies, this is for sure. If Gazprom loses its monopoly over the gas transportation system, it will no longer invest billions of dollars into absolutely unnecessary pipelines, such as the pipeline between Sakhalin and Vladivostok. There is no gas at one side, there is no consumption at the other side. But the pipeline has been built at great expense. It is the same story with the power of Siberia. The Chinese do not need that amount of gas. And when we look at the Gazprom's own calculations about the feasibility, commercial feasibility of the project, we see that the payback is never received for that project. Absolutely. So it is not commercial at all. So if Gazprom loses its politicized hold on the industry, it would be to the benefit of everybody, absolutely. Well, I'm not sure about Georgia, but for example, take Armenia. Very gradually, Gazprom established full control over the Armenian gas industry. Now Gazprom supplies gas to the border of Armenia and sells it not to the Armenians, but to its own subsidiary at a fraction of the price. Then the subsidiary resells it to the Armenian population and industrial users for higher price. And nobody sees the difference returned to the Russian budget or to the budget of Gazprom. So it's a trick, it's a lousy trick, and the trick is repeated in very many countries. And if such intermediaries are eliminated, and if Gazprom is no longer able to resort to monopoly practices, it will be to the benefit of everybody.
All right, thank you very much. Another question about natural gas and Russia is coming from Zlata Sergeyeva. It's actually public, but I'll read it out. Well, first, thank you, Mikhail Ivanovich, for your insightful and deep and thoughtful speech as usual. And then the question, as we were gathering here and talking, we got the news about Albert Avdolian, the co-founder of the Yota telecommunications company, announcing that he will invest, I think, an estimate of $10 billion into an LNG project in Yakutia. So how do you estimate the recent news about that?
Yes, I know about that. Yes, Yakutia has a lot of gas. And Yakutia cannot find any way to monetize huge reserves of gas in the country. And to reach the sea is very difficult. It would mean to build a gas pipeline of 1,300 kilometers in the middle of nowhere in a very difficult terrain to the Sea of Okhotsk, and to build an LNG plant on the shore of the Sea of Okhotsk. And I'm not sure if there would be, any payback on such an expensive. I think $10 billion is not enough for the project of that scale. And I'm very much in doubt about the feasibility of this project. It looks very interesting because there is gas, there is some potential market in the Pacific area. It's impossible to market that gas. I looked into that project before when the previous owner of those reserves asked me to look into that project. There was a possibility of producing methanol, for example, and exporting it to China. But the Chinese decided they do not want that. And then other companies which looked into the project also said, no, we do not want to help the Chinese to get that methanol, and building an LNG plant with such characteristics so far away from the sea, from the fields, and it's not commercial, they believe. So I remain pessimistic, but I have learned long ago not to say never to oil and gas projects. I remember when I was analyzing the project of Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan and Baku-Tbilisi-Erzurum oil and gas pipelines, I did not believe they would be possible because there were so many factors against those projects. But they are operational, they are expanding, and they are quite commercial and nicely looking. And so I was mistaken. So now I do not say never again.
All right, thank you. And then with that interesting note, we're passing to another forecast-related question. It's about your personal forecast. The question is from Nikolai Mizin. Your personal forecast for the project completion or putting into operation of Turkish Stream and Nord Stream 2 in 2020. And if I may add just another question related to Nord Stream 2, just to put it all together, give me a second, please. Yeah, it looks like Germany is going to abandon further cooperation with Russia in Nord Stream 2 project, according to the possible anti-monopoly decision of German regulator. This last part is from Maxim Nedria from Slovakia.
Yes, it looks like that. There is no final decision as far as I know. There was only one source, German source, the Handelsblatt newspaper, which reported that Germany has already decided to abandon the support of that project. But basically, it was the decision is based on the resolution of the European Commission. The resolution allowed some derogation or exemption of pipeline projects at the will of the German government if the project were finished, completed by a certain date in 2019. The project has not been completed. The Russian party argues that we have already spent all the money we have invested, it's 100% investment is finalized. No, the resolution says the project should be in place by that date. It is not in place, so there should be no support of the German regulator to the exemption of this project from the anti-monopoly rules of the European Union. First, then I do not believe Gazprom will be able to finish the construction of the pipeline. It does not have the vessel for that. Now, the only vessel which can theoretically do the trick is near Kaliningrad in the Baltic Sea. It came there from Nakhodka in the Far East, and it is the Academic Charsky pipe laying crane, but it is not equipped with assembly and installing the pipes of the required diameter. It has to go somewhere to get the new equipment for that first. Then, if it goes to the site, if it receives the agreement of the Danish regulator first from Denmark, and then if it goes and starts completing the construction of the pipeline, there are the American sanctions. And the sanctions, the law of the sanctions does not say the administration may introduce any sanction. It says shall. So it is a must for the White House to introduce sanctions against the owner of that vessel, against the vessel itself. And the owner is Gazprom. So it will be, if Gazprom goes with this vessel to build the pipeline, it would mean the 100% there will be sanctions against the Russian gas company, Gazprom. So I don't think it is possible to finish the job. It's some sort of monument to the, appetites of the Russian pipeline builders.
Thank you. There was a question on the Turkish streams.
Yes, and the Turkish stream is another very big problem. Okay, Gazprom reached the agreement with Turkey to accept some of gas at one string of the Turkish stream to replace this, replace the gas that comes from Russia, from Ukraine, Romania, and Bulgaria, the Balkan route. There is such an agreement, but some of the route is still operational, some of the Balkan route. They are still, they have not finished the switch from one route to another one. Then there is another string of Turk stream, which is, it ends up in Turkey. Before entering the territory of the European Union, it should get the permit from the European regulator, from the European Commission. But Gazprom has not asked for any permit because the route is to cross several borders within the European Union, from Bulgaria going into Serbia, which is not a member of the European Union, then from Serbia into Hungary, from Hungary into Austria, and it requires special permission. As a trans-border pipeline in the European Union. There is no such permission yet. Yes, the Bulgarians say we are prepared to build our part of that. In Serbia, the pipeline is almost completed by Gazprom, but Hungary and Bulgaria, they remain still, nobody can say what happens to the plan of building those segments of the pipeline. And Bulgaria is already building a pipeline from Greece to bring more gas. And the Bulgarians are now willing to become equity owners, co-owners of the LNG terminal in Greece, the new one, to deliver more gas, non-Russian gas to Bulgaria. And the Bulgarians have signed a contract with Azerbaijan to get 1 billion cubic meters of gas per year from Azerbaijan. It is 30% of the gas they consume, they get from Russia right now. So in a couple of years, I think the Bulgarians can safely do without any assistance from Gazprom. And if they buy some gas from Gazprom, it will be because the price is very good, but not because it is they have to do that because there is no other source. So I'm still pessimistic about the completion of the third stream into Bulgaria, then Serbia, and Hungary into Austria to Baumgarten. In Austria, there is no signal that the permission is in place and that Gazprom can do anything to get that permission.
All right, thank you very much, dear friends, colleagues. Do you have any other, although I do think that we have had quite a lot of questions and quite good answers in very much detail. All right, sorry, I was looking at the chat. So anyway, if there's no other question or comment, Dr. Krutikhin, thank you very much. This was really a pleasure to have you here. I know your time is very precious and we're honored that you have been here with us and gave your insightful comments and actually a good lecture and speech. As I promised, this will be posted and shared online to make it widely available for the public. And if there's any last minute comments or something that anybody came up with, please go ahead. Otherwise, I would say thank you all.
Yes, and thank you very much for
complete this call
with this audience.
Yeah. I just want to remind that Mr. Krutikhin has been our guest for the last time before this in 2017. So it's been 3 years we haven't seen each other at EUSP, this time online, but still we consider you a guest of European University St. Petersburg. And hopefully once things are gone, you will visit us in person as well. Thank you.
You.
Bye-bye.